The International Criminal Court has reportedly decided to spare former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, even if it investigates allegations of war crimes in the upcoming Iraq War Inquiry report in Britain.
In a context where the crimes of imperialism are growing, are amassing, one of the most notorious war criminals, i.e. Tony Blair, should not, in the interest of imperialism, seem to be facing any justice whatsoever.
British newspaper The Telegraph says the ICC has made the point in an official answer to the Daily's inquiry. This ahead of the long-awaited publication of the Chilcot report on Wednesday. The court says Blair's decision to join the US in the invasion of Iraq does not fall within its jurisdiction, but it could put soldiers on trial over war crimes in the Arab country.
It is within their jurisdiction to investigate Tony Blair or anyone else that is suspected of a war crime. However, as you may know, that the ICC is a political animal, so they go with countries that have less ability to defend themselves. For example, Africa, Central African Republic, Ivory Coast, those kinds of places, and we've seen it over and over and over again.
The revelation has outraged the families of British soldiers killed in Iraq. The so-called Chilcot inquiry is expected to strongly criticise Blair for misleading MPs to gain their support for an illegal war on Iraq. Blair has been under pressure for years over his decision to join the US under former President George W. Bush to invade Iraq. He has been accused of committing war crimes in Iraq for financial gains. Blair has attended an inquiry in Britain to answer questions for dragging the country into the war on a number of occasions.
This man should be arrested for war crimes. JP Morgan paid him off for the Iraq war. 3 months after we invaded Iraq, they held up the Iraq bank for $20 billion. He was then paid $6 million every year and still is from JP Morgan 6 months after he left office. The man is a war criminal.
Blair and Bush built their case to attack Iraq on the claim that the former Iraqi regime had weapons of mass destruction. The British government, in particular, made up a file named the Iraq Dossier, which accused the country of having sought uranium in Africa to make nukes. Those claims were never proved, nor were the banned arms found in Iraq after the country was occupied. The war devastated Iraq's infrastructure, which had been damaged by years of all-out UN sanctions before the US and British invasion. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis were killed during the Iraq War, while the US and Britain lost thousands of troops in the conflict. Years after the withdrawal of British troops and US forces from Iraq, people in Britain are pushing for Blair's trial for war crimes, a demand which has yet to be met.
I'd like to welcome my guests to the program out of London from the Stop the War Coalition, Mr. Jim Brett, and out of Washington, D.C., former U.S. Ambassador to Iraq, Mr. Edward Peck. Thank you both for being with us. Well, let's start this off in London with Jim Brand. What does it mean that the ICC says it will be digging through the 2.3 million word report to find signs of war crimes and would prosecute soldiers if war crimes are found, but would not prosecute Tony Blair, the man who ordered the soldiers to do what they did?
Well, if you go back to 2 months before the launch of the war, the chief legal advisor of the British Foreign Office wrote his opinion that the war would be, as he put it, a crime of aggression. The deputy legal advisor resigned from the British Foreign Office 1 day before the invasion, saying that she could not continue in her job because what the British government was about to do the following day would be a crime of aggression. So they both used that term, crime of aggression. The Nuremberg judgment of 1946 said the supreme international crime was the crime of aggression. But when the International Criminal Court was set up in 1998, I think it was, the definition of the crime of aggression was left out of the jurisdiction of the court. And I think that tells you an enormous amount. If it is agreed across the world that the supreme international crime is the crime of aggression, and then you set up the International Criminal Court and it leaves out the crime of aggression, then you have clearly some explaining to do. So that leaves the other lesser crimes within the jurisdiction of the court. Now, in the meantime, since the Iraq War, they have introduced the crime of aggression into the jurisdiction of the court, but that came some years after the invasion of Iraq. So you have this very strange situation that the International Criminal Court cannot prosecute Blair for the supreme international crime, and that explains the situation.
All right. Well, Mr. Peck, your take on that. It seems odd that the ICC would be set up and crime of aggression would not be included in this. Is it something that was done on purpose to allow a loophole? Or how do you see this at this point in time that the ICC can't prosecute Blair?
Well, I guess it's honest to say, or fair to say at least, that a certain amount of politics enters into everything that goes on both domestically and internationally. And I doubt very much if the ICC was totally protected from any inputs from outside. It could have been an oversight. It could have been intentional. I guess you'll have to ask the people who were involved in the decision. But it seems fairly clear to me that even in the UN Charter, from which the ICC draws a certain amount of its authority, there were some restrictions placed upon just going to war because a country felt like it. And I suppose that now, with this decision that they have reached concerning Mr. Blair, there will be more people looking rather closely at that particular absence, which has been, as just stated, recently or relatively recently corrected to include a war of aggression.
Well, Mr. Brand, isn't the function, though, of the ICC to try individuals who are accused, though, of committing war crimes or genocide? Isn't that part of the responsibility of the ICC?
Well, it is, but as your introduction made clear, the picking of targets for the ICC is also very unusual, because I think so far every single indicted person tried by the ICC is an African.
Right.
And none of them is, of course, accused of the crime of aggression. So you have the lopsidedness of picking what are in effect the lesser crimes, because if you take the dictum of the Nuremberg Court of 1946, it said that to wage a war of aggression is the supreme international crime, containing within itself the accumulated evil of the whole. So that was the intent of it, that the things that happen in war are as a result of waging of a war of aggression. That was the entire logic of the Nuremberg Court. Mm-hmm. If you take away the war crime, the crime of aggression, initiating a war, and you prosecute crimes outside of that context, then you certainly change the basis of international law. And that's why the imbalance of, for example, prosecuting Africans for crime, for what are crimes by very serious judgments, but fall outside of accepted international law, a distortion of it. And therefore I would put great skepticism on these indictments of Africans, because if you can't try it according to accepted principles, then I don't think you should try these things at all.
Well, Mr. Peck, when we look at Tony Blair and that he lied to the British people, he lied to the Parliament, of course, as George W. Bush also lied to the American people too. If, for example, the ICC then cannot prosecute individuals such as Blair, such as Bush, where then should be gone for justice as far as with this situation? Then who has authority? Which entity has authority then to prosecute these individuals?
Well, that's a very compelling question, which can only be answered, I think, in terms of addressing it to particular individual situations. I would like to say that, though, when you mentioned Mr. Blair and Mr. Bush lying, I believe it's fairly conclusive that they were told by people upon whom they relied and whom they trusted to tell them what the facts were. And they relayed facts to Mr. Blair and Mr. Bush saying, you know, he does have weapons of mass destruction. He does, he does, he does. Now, whether the people who said that knew they were lying or not doesn't affect directly the people who conveyed that information, because they thought that they could count upon their experts. Your larger question, though, is how does this work? Of course.
Go ahead, Jim Brad.
Yeah. Can I just jump in there? I actually have a copy of the document that you showed a glimpse of earlier on, and I think that really does answer the question, because it was produced 6 months before the start of the war. It's titled, as you can see, Iraq's Weapons of Mass Destruction, the Assessment of the British Government. So it is the entire case of the British government, even though they said other things later on, but they maintained this position that it was a question of weapons of mass destruction. And if you look at the first page, I'm afraid the lie begins there, because Blair says, I know that Iraq has nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. That's essentially what he says. And that has to be a lie, because there is no evidence in this document. I've read the whole thing. It runs to, I think, 70 pages. There are no facts in it to justify that statement on page 1. So Blair's statement on page 1 of the British government case for war is not based on any facts in that document. Therefore, he lied. I think it's as simple as that. It's not down to the officials, because there are just scrapings, cuttings. There are some really laughable things in that document, quite absurd things. And you cannot base that statement of Blair's on anything in the dossier. Therefore, Blair is guilty and not the officials.
Mr. Peck, you want to comment?
Well, it's entirely possible. I'm sure that the gentleman knows far more about what happened there. But it is also clear, you remember we had a Secretary of State, Colin Powell, a man who was essentially universally respected and admired. And they sent him up to the United Nations Security Council, where he presented what he called incontrovertible proof that Iraq had places where they were producing these weapons, even though the people who prepared them for Mr. Powell knew that they were not weapons manufacturing plants. So he lost it. His credibility was destroyed.
So what is behind this? You mentioned that, Mr. Peck. Let me just jump in here. Then where is the conspiracy? Who has done what would be the questions, because we now know, of course, that Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction. And it seems like no one really cares that this lie was told by whom, and the ramifications of that lie that, of course, the Iraqis and beyond are still reeling from today. So your take on that, sir?
Well, I think it's rather clear that in the United States, as in every other country, there are people who have views and opinions which differ from those views and opinions held by others. So there were people in the United States who wanted Saddam Hussein removed from power, because he was considered to be one of the slimiest creature that ever oozed over the surface of the world, because he had invaded Kuwait, a friend, because he had fought a war with Iran. And all of a sudden, the preponderance of opinion shifted, because if you remember, when the Iraq-Iran war was going on, the United States supported Iraq, because we perceived Iran as being a different and more dangerous threat to our interest in the Middle East. Israel, on the other hand, saw Iraq as a bigger danger, so they were kind of supporting Iran. And this is the weight of opinion that swings back and forth in these countries.
Well, Mr. Peck, but the question I asked, Mr. Peck, sorry, sir, but the question that I asked is basically that this has happened, and we all know that it was a lie. Now, why aren't there intensive investigations being done, whether we're talking about in London, whether we're talking about in Washington, about who is actually responsible and to bring those responsible parties to justice? We're talking about millions of lives that have been affected by this lie.
I fully agree with your conclusion, but it is almost impossible in a country like ours, like the United States, perhaps like Great Britain and elsewhere, to determine who and what was pushing the buttents.
Okay. Let me get Mr. Brand back in on this. Okay, stay with me, sir. Mr. Brand, your take on that. Is it that it is very difficult in a country like the UK or the US to actually find who's responsible, or is it that it's really not that much of a priority?
Clearly the second. I think the second possibility that you put forward absolutely seems to be the answer. Because if you go back to the Nuremberg judgment that I quoted earlier, that came as a consequence of the Second World War. And as a result of the Second World War, Japan, Germany, and Italy all got new constitutions directly as a result of the war. And in each of those constitutions, in some way or another, the Nuremberg principles are embodied. By no means perfectly, because, for example, Japan, not only by its constitution was required to renounce war, as simple as that, but also to maintain no armed forces. Now, Japan, in fact, has quite strong armed forces. They just don't call them armed forces. So you have to be very careful if just to say, well, the thing is there in words. The question is it there indeed? But nevertheless, the fact is that those three countries, in one way or another, had to incorporate the spirit of the Nuremberg principles into their constitutions. No such thing happened in Britain and the United States. And you can illustrate that quite simply because some people in 2003 in Britain took actions against American and British military bases. For example, they broke into a US bomber base in Britain and smashed the wheels of a B-52, you know, the giant bomber aircraft that was actually about to bomb Iraq from Britain. And they smashed the wheels of it and caused damage, and they were arrested and charged with causing criminal damage. It went to court, and their defense was that they were preventing a greater crime, namely the crime of aggression. So the question arose in the British courts, could you recognize the crime of aggression as a crime under English law? And it took 3 years to go up through the court process, and it reached the Supreme Court. And they ruled that, yes, there was a case, that you could definitely make a case that the British government, and Blair in particular, had committed a war crime by waging a war of aggression.
Okay, stay with me, because I want to come back to you on that point that you have just made. But let me just talk to Mr. Peck about this last question, because we're just about out of time. When we look at the situation that Blair lied basically to the Parliament and about Saddam Hussein and so many things that we've talked about, although you said perhaps that he had been told by others, although Mr. Brand with his documents basically showing that he made an adamant statement, not based on any particular facts, as though it was an agenda, the same agenda that George W. Bush had at this point in time. Now we're talking about many years after the fact. Do you think that we are going to see individuals such as a Tony Blair, such as George W. Bush, actually pay for what they have done, or at least go to trial somewhere?
You're asking me?
Yes, Mr. Peck.
I am not an expert. I would say no, with a trace of disappointment, because it is fairly clear to me that international politics are not always ruled and conducted in keeping with laws and beliefs and behaviors of many people. I think it's too late. I think there are still too many people who are convinced You know, as they were told repetitively by people in the government of the United States, that the minute Saddam Hussein is gone, democracy will burst into bloom all over the Middle East, you know, on the far fringes of likelihood. Thank you. So I don't think that they would be prosecuted, no. I think it's too late, they are too powerful, there are too many other things going on. It would be damaging probably to all parties, even if, in the eyes of some, justice were served.
And Mr. Brown, back to the point that you were making about British court, and then my question is, if then it was ruled about Blair basically being a war criminal, is it likely that he can actually be prosecuted in the national court? If the ICC does not seem that it will do anything, how likely is it to take place inside of the UK itself?
No, the prospect is not good, certainly at the moment. The conclusion I was about to make was that the Supreme Court ruled that because the British Parliament had not specifically passed a law incorporating the Nuremberg principles into British law, therefore the customary international, the Nuremberg judgment, could not be used in a British court. That was the conclusion of the Supreme Court. I think the way history goes, the chances are that Blair will get away with it on balance. But never say never, because the world is changing, things are moving, the finger of blame is pointing. Blair is by no means off the hook. And if you said to me that the development of events was such that in 2, 3, 5 years' time, things might change, I would not rule it out. Okay. It is possible.